My hand, The Bait of Satan. It's an incredible read, and it's so common this time of year for people to remember old offenses.
Wow. I realized right then this is a very, very important topic for the lives of all people because, you know, it is the very, very foundation of Calvary. And Jesus forgave us when we didn't deserve to be forgiven. Yeah. And, you know, Jesus makes a statement. He said that in the last days, the days we're living in, he was speaking specifically about the time right before he would come back. He said many would be offended. And the Greek word there, many, actually means majority. So at least 51%. He said many would be offended, would betray one another, and would hate one another. Now, that's a progression. An offended person will eventually betray. And if a betrayal is not dealt with, it will ultimately lead to hatred. And where I get that from is Proverbs chapter 18, verse 19 says, a brother offended is harder to win than a strong city. What did strong cities have around them? They had walls. What were walls built for? Protection. Yeah. So if somebody, let's say you invite somebody to come over for Thanksgiving or Christmas, and they choose somebody else. Now, they've hurt my feelings. I start building thought processes or reasonings in my mind of why they're against me. They've hurt me. I'm not going to get hurt again. We'll see if I'm going to invite them again. See if I'm going to do this for that again. And so what happens is people begin to build these walls up, and these walls are built out of hurt. Somebody has disappointed me, let me down. We set ourselves up for an offense by our expectations. Okay? Basically, in other words, and this is why Christians many times will say, well, you know, the world treats me better than most Christians. The reason is, when we look at the world, our expectation on the world is zero. So if the world does something nice for me, well, they've blessed me. But then our expectation on most Christians is about that high, and then our expectations on our pastors is about that high, and our expectations on our husbands or wives are about that high. Yeah. And so the higher our expectation is on somebody, the greater the potential offense. So in other words, when I expect something from you, I expect you to do something for me, I can easily become offended. Yeah. And offense is something that will literally bring you into a trap. The word for offense is the Greek word scandalon. It's actually an ancient Greek word that was originally used to describe the bait stick of a trap that hunters would use to catch small animals and birds in. The hunter would place the bait on the scandalon, the animal would take it, and the trap would close and either capture or kill the animal or small bird. Wow. Thereby, an offense is the bait of Satan to pull believers into his captivity. Wow. And so the really scary thing is, as Paul said to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, he said that in the last days, well, he doesn't say actually in the last days, but yes, he does. He's talking about the whole last days there. He said that people are going to be in opposition with one another, and these people that are in opposition with one another, he said they're going to be taken captive of Satan to do Satan's will. So again, he affirms what Jesus says. When Jesus says in Luke 17, it's impossible that offenses will not come. In other words, you're going to have the opportunity to get offended, but what you do with it's going to determine your future. Either you're going to become stronger and you're going to become more resilient, or you're going to become bitter and you're going to get trapped. Wow. And so there are so many. I have preached this message literally all over the world, and what astounds me is I've never once seen less than 50% of the people respond at the end of the service when I give the call to be free from offense. Wow. I've seen as much as 80% of the people standing up. I've seen almost every time 50 to 60% of the people standing up. So I've literally seen Jesus' words fulfilled. We have a massive amount of offense. And what's really scary is Jesus said many will be offended, they'll betray one another, they'll hate one another. And he said many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. The many who? The many that are offended, which tells me that an offended heart is the breeding ground of deception. Wow. And deception's really scary because the person that's deceived believes with all their heart they're right, when in actuality they're wrong. And then he goes on to say, because lawlessness is going to abound, and this is all Matthew 24, the love of many is going to grow cold. And the Greek word for love that he uses there is the Greek word agape, which is the word that is only used for believers. So what he's saying there is the majority that are going to be offended are not just society. He's saying people inside the church. Wow. And so many are going to be ensnared and trapped and held captive. And that's why you find that so many people that are offended are tormented. They can constantly rehearse, oh, they did this to me, they did that to me, they said this about me, they didn't invite me. And what happens is, now they're in the trap of torment. They built that wall, and the one that's caged in is now themselves. Well, I think what happens is people are more concerned about being right than being one.
That's good.
If you look at human beings, we're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
We're going to do things wrong. Now, we don't want to make mistakes. We don't want to do things wrong if our heart is right, but we're going to.
Yeah.
And if we do, that means there's got to be some kind of concession. You see, here's the way I look at it, because I've had so many Christians look at me and say, I just can't forgive them. I just can't forgive them. And I look at them and I'd say to them, the reason you can't forgive is because you don't realize what you've been forgiven of.
Wow.
So a Christian who cannot forgive is a person that has never even realized or forgotten what they've been forgiven of. Because when we look at Jesus, when Adam sinned against God, God the Father could have looked at Jesus and said, you know what? They sinned against us. They chose the devil over us. Let them all go to hell with the devil and burn forever. And let's go over and build another universe and create somebody who really loves us. He would have been perfectly just to do that. Our just reward was to burn in a lake of fire forever and ever and ever. Yet Jesus came, chose to come and bear what we did wrong and forgive us before we ever said, I'm sorry. So, you know, Jesus says in Matthew 18 that when you refuse to forgive, because he tells that parable, the parable of the great king who has a servant that's brought to him and owes him basically $10 billion.
Yeah.
And he forgives the guy, and the guy goes out and finds a fellow servant, and the fellow servant owes him basically 1/3 of a year's salary. Now, 1/3 of a year's salary is significant. So what Jesus is saying is his fellow servant really did him wrong. I mean, if somebody took 1/3 of what you made an entire year bill and said, hey, Bill, sorry, you wouldn't go, dude, don't even think about it, not a problem. That's not one of those little offenses. That's a serious offense.
Right.
But what Jesus is saying is 1/3 of a year's salary. So let's say a guy makes $30,000 a year. $10,000 compared to $10 billion, it's not even a drop in the bucket. Yeah. So what Jesus is saying is the very worst thing that we can do to one another is like comparing a $10,000 debt to a $10 billion debt compared to what we did with God.
Wow.
And that's why I said a person who cannot forgive is a person who's forgotten what they've been forgiven of. We've got to remember, we're the ones that offended God first. And the level that we offended him was a $10 billion debt level. The very worst thing we can do to one another is a $10,000 debt level. So that's why a person who can't forgive is a person who doesn't realize what they've been forgiven of. And I went through a deep, deep wounding offense over 20 years ago. And the person that was somebody I looked up to, he was probably closer than my own dad. I mean, he was like a spiritual father to me. And he did some things over a course of a year that were devastating. It was so obvious people were coming up to me going, you okay? Are you all right? And I was like, yeah, I'm fine. I'm going on with the call of God in my life. And what the problem was is I was too proud to admit that I was offended. I saw being offended as weakness. I was too proud to admit that I was offended. Yeah. And so for months, the love of God in my heart just kept getting colder and colder and colder and colder. Ministry started becoming to me more of an occupation rather than a passion.
Wow.
And I remember one time, Lisa and I were driving down the road, and there's a worship CD in, right? Lisa's worshiping and weeping. It's just one of those real anointed CDs. And she looks over at me, and I got this stone-cold look on my face, and she goes, John, what's wrong? And I said, no, nothing. I'm meditating, you worship. I'm just thinking. I was just so proud. And so finally, I got so cold because Jesus said, you know, their love would grow cold. I walked out my back porch one day, and I said, God, am I offended? And I heard this on the inside of me. Yes! I mean, it's the loudest I've ever heard the voice of God.
Wow.
And I remember I just said, Lord, I've prayed by faith. I've fasted. I've confessed. I can't get out of this. I need help. And so I remember I was on the end of a 4-day fast, and I went to a funeral, and this guy was conducting the funeral, and I'm sitting in the back, and 3/4 of the way through the funeral, the wells open up, tears start pouring down my face, and I said, I forgive you. I release you. I forgive you. And I walked out and I thought, oh, it's done. Everything's good now. Well, 2 weeks later, I saw the guy again, and I thought, I can't believe he's so blessed. He did this to me, and he did that to me, and he did this to that person, and he did that to me. And I remember leaving thinking about it, and I talked about it at lunch that afternoon. I thought about it later on that afternoon. I talked about it at dinner. I went to bed thinking about it. I got up the next morning. I took a shower, and I was thinking about it. And I thought, I'm still being tormented.
Yeah.
And I said, God, what's going on? Well, there was a principle that I didn't understand, and that is what Paul said in Acts 24:16. And Paul made the statement, he said, herein do I exercise to always having a conscience free from offense with God and men. And the key word is exercise. And so I remember the Lord spoke to me right after that, and he said, son, you need to exercise. I said, what do you mean exercise? And he gave me the scripture, Matthew 5, I think it's 5:44, where Jesus said, pray for those who abuse you and mistreat you. Now, isn't it interesting, in the Gospels, Jesus never says pray for your mother. He never says pray for your dad. He says pray for those that mistreat you. Now, we are supposed to pray for our mother. We are supposed to pray for our father.
Sure.
But the one he identifies is the one that mistreats us. So I remember I got up from the table and the Lord spoke to me and I said, Lord, I pray for him. Bless him if you can. The next day I'm praying. I said, by the way, if you can, bless him. And that's the way I prayed for the guy for 4 weeks. Well, that's like, you know, when somebody gets injured, like a football player blows out his knee,
yeah.
What do? They do physical therapy, and they exercise to get that knee back to where it was before they got injured. Well, what that kind of prayer was like lifting a penny. I'm not going to get any better doing that.
Right.
So after about 5 weeks of praying like that, exercising, praying like that, I'm reading Psalm 35. And David says in Psalm 35, fierce witnesses rise up. They ask me things I do not know. They reward me evil for good. And I thought, that's me. I did this guy good. He's rewarded me evil for it. So I'm thinking the next verse, David's going to say, Lord, break their jaw, right? Bust their teeth, right? And that's not what he says. He says, but as for me, when they were sick, I prayed for them like my mother or my brother.
Wow.
And the Lord spoke to me and he said, you pray for that man, what you want me to do in your life, or basically your family. That changed everything. I got up from the table and I said, Lord, I pray. I lifted up this man's name. I pray that he would know you the best a man could know you. I pray that he would walk with you as closely as a man could walk with you. I pray that you'd surround him with your angels. And I'm telling you, it was hard to pray that way.
Yeah.
Because my soul didn't want that. But when that guy's lifting 20 pounds on a leg curl machine, he's screaming with pain. Well, what happened is I started praying like that for about 5 weeks. And one day I was praying and I screamed his name out and I said, so-and-so, I love you. I was deep in prayer, Bill, and when I said it, it was like junk came out of my gut. And I thought, I'm healed.
Wow.
And so the key to getting over the fence is to pray, but not pray superficially. Pray passionately what you want God to do in your life or your family's life for that person that has wounded you. If somebody does that, what happens is they will exercise themselves to have a conscience free from offense. And when you get free from offense, you become free.